podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam. This is All Across America. Jack, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So this is All Across America. There is probably no subject more fitting than to be talking about the bald eagle, the regal eagle. You're the author of The Bald Eagle, The Improbable Journey of America's Bird. One thing that really stood out to me in the book, and as you said, the regal eagle is of our imagination. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that what I did mean is that we essentially create, as we do with a lot of animals and a lot of people, we create a mythic individual or mythic species, which is not to say that there's not some truth in myth. I'm not saying mythical, but I'm saying mythic. And so, throughout the nation's history, we've created this image of the bald eagle again as regal, as something that deserves our reverence. At least the symbol of the bald eagle has deserved our reverence throughout American history, but not always the species itself. And then there's this other species. There's this other side of the eagle that we've created. Is this on the species side? And I was speaking historically of a predator that needed to be controlled, if not, in fact, eradicated. And so we created the myths about the eagle's predation on our possessions, primarily meaning our livestock.
Right. And, it's the bald eagle is, first of all, it's not bald. Speaking to somebody
Right.
who is bald, do you feel like that's a little bit of stolen valor there? Or?
Valor is the key word, Mark. Yeah, and I write all about that in the book, why it's called the bald eagle and what it potentially means and how it potentially got its name. It probably has something to do with the word piebald, which means to be spotted or to have a couple of contrasting colors, typically white and some dark color, which of course the bald eagle does. But I also say that it could also have something to do with the behavior that we associate with the bald eagle. It's an intrepid bird, yes, of course, but it's also a very bold bird, and the word, a synonymous word with bold is bald, and so the origin of the name could come from that, or it could come from a combination of images of the bald eagle.
Almost reminds me of Nome, Alaska. It was originally on the map. It was just
Right.
name question mark, and it became Nome, Alaska. So
Yeah.
we talked about that on the podcast. But also, the scream is not what we know of as the eagle scream. Is not the eagle scream.
Right. So the scream that we typically, and I mean, more and more people are familiar with the actual call of the bald eagle, which is less a scream than it is a cry or
Mm,
chitter. As I say in the book, at times it sounds like a tea kettle coming to boil, and
yeah.
many people are associated or have their reference for the sound of the bald eagle comes from television and movies, in which a red-tailed hawk is usually the stand-in or the voiceover, because it has at least in our mind, a much more fearful sound than the bald eagle. The bald eagle sound is almost wimpy.
Yeah.
Again, that's to our ears, but also, as I say in the book, to a squirrel or rabbit who hears a bald eagle, that's no wimpy sound.
Right. Exactly. They're not making that sound for humans' benefit. Is for their prey.
Exactly, exactly. We might like to think that, but that's obviously not true. You're right.
And then the other piece of this majestic, noble bird is that the bald eagle is a scavenger and a thief.
Yes, yes, very much so. They'll get down and dirty right there with the vultures on the side of the road. In fact, they'll keep the vultures at bay. The vultures will stay back when there's roadkill that an eagle is interested in, and they'll let the eagle have its take and wait patiently to the side. And so, yes, they are definitely scavengers, and they're also there are a lot of animal species that are have a tendency to steal food from others, even their own kind. And the bald eagle is most famous for stealing fish from osprey in midair, but they also steal from each other. It's quite common. And it's probably more common among the juvenile bald eagles. They reach maturity about 4 or 5 years. That's when they'll get their white head feathers and their white tail feathers and their yellow talons and beak. And before then, they start out as almost solid chocolate, and then they become mottled with a little bit of white here and there. And the mom and dad don't teach them how to fish. They have to learn that on their own by watching others and by trial and error. And so the juveniles are generally not well, they're not like anybody who's, they're amateurs. Like anybody starting out, they're not very adept, and so their catch rate is quite low. So sometimes it's easier to steal or easier to scavenge.
Where do you think, and this idea of the regal eagle wasn't the white man's creation. This is dating back to Native Americans. In the eagle, there is all the wisdom in the world. It was the Lakota holy man had said that, chief of all animals and creator of humankind. Where did it get this idea of nobility and majesty? Where do you think
Yeah.
it came from?
Well, you're right that it really begins with native cultures, and because I mean, first of all, the bald eagle lives nowhere else in the world but except North America. So it's truly an all-American bird, and so native peoples that have lived. The oldest fossil evidence of bald eagles on Earth dates to about 1 million years ago. And, native peoples have been human beings have been north in North America, as far as we can tell, it's somewhere between 10 and 20,000 years. And and so as long as they've been here, bald eagles have been here as well. And for many native cultures, as you suggested, the bald eagle is considered a spirit bird. It's a high flying bird, and many have said that it's the highest flying bird. It's not. The crane flies. There are certain cranes that fly quite higher than bald eagles, but bald eagles will hit 10,000 feet, which is pretty good. So they're flying close to the heavens or to the spirit worlds, and so they have been perceived as liaisons or messenger birds, and also like other animal species in native cultures, relatives of people of the people. And again, I mean the bald eagle, eh, you know, legitimately from a human perspective, whether you're a Native American or Euro American or whomever, it does convey some really powerful images. Strength and courage, despite despite its cry rather than its scream. And so it does have this very charismatic, physically a charismatic appeal to it that transcends cultures.
And I mean, it does have some truly remarkable qualities. The eagle eye thing that's for real.
Yes, yes, yeah. So we're not sure exactly how much stronger the eyesight of eagles is compared with humans, but some say 8 times greater, and they can also see in color spectrums as other birds can that we don't see, and so a a white rabbit in the white snow a mile away from an eagle perching on a branch. They often hunt from the perch to conserve energy, is not camouflage in the eyes of the eagle. They can see a white rabbit in the white snow quite clearly, or a grayish squirrel in the tree. It's they're just not well camouflaged. So eagle eye is really an appropriate expression.
And their wings are super strong.
Their wings are quite strong, and that's clearly evident from their ability to swim. They swim with their wings. I mean, they don't do so intentionally, but they might grab a fish that's quite large, and the fish is strong and it'll pull it down. And in some cases, the eagles have to swim the fish to the shore, and they're very very strong swimmers with those wings. And so the wingspan can reach 7, 8 feet, even larger. And bald eagles, the top out at 14 pounds. Northern bald eagles, which are slightly larger than southern bald eagles, and so 14 pounds for a bird is a good bit of weight.
Yeah.
And so I mean, when you think about a white rump sandpiper, but that which is not physically a small bird, but it only weighs a couple of grams,
Wow.
and the same as two slices of bread. And so those bald eagle wings that tends to be true with raptors generally. And raptors include osprey and hawks and falcons and owls. And so, yeah, those, I mean, they can carry up to 5 pounds. And that's where we can talk about this whenever you want, but that's where one of the myths come in. I mean, bald eagles were wrongfully accused of stealing all kinds of wildlife, lambs and sheep and pigs and calves, you name it. They can steal chickens, and they love to steal chickens. As one free range chicken farmer told me, his chickens are low hanging fruit to a bald eagle. But they can't carry away those other animals. But they've been accused, even in the early days, by ornithologists, among them John James Audubon, of flying long distances carrying, you know, quite heavy livestock, which simply is not possible.
And so that was one of the reasons behind the, I mean, large scale eradication of the eagle, that it was almost seen as a coyote or a wolf.
That's it, same category. You're absolutely right. It was placed in the same categories as wolves and coyotes and mountain lions and bears. It was predator that needed to be controlled, needed to be eradicated. And to do so was actually to shoot a bald eagle or club a bald to kill a bald eagle was considered, and we're talking the 18th, 19th century and on into the early 20th century, considered as a civic duty. And you were taking care of not your livestock, your neighbor's livestock. And of course, in the 19th century, I mean, people who lived in urban areas, many of them raised chickens in their backyards. You lived in these mill villages. They had chickens, and so bald eagles, of course, as well as hawks and others would steal chickens. And so when I was doing my research, I did a search on newspapers.com with a date range, as I recall, it was 1840, 1850 to 1920, a three-letter word search in that date range, in quotation marks, bald eagle shot. And I came up with 140,000 hits.
Oh my goodness.
And the thing is, obviously, I didn't read all 140,000 of those articles, but my research assistant and I read a good, share of them. And condemning somebody for killing a bald eagle or shooting a bald eagle was very, very rare. I mean, I had to dig deep to find some newspaper that I complained about a bald eagle being shot and killed or clubbed and killed. Instead, the killing of bald eagles was reported much like, you know, Joe Davis catching a 20-pound largemouth bass down at the lake, reporting on, hey, he's caught this big fish and this is what it weighed. Good for him. And it was the same thing with bald eagles. The bald eagle, so and so shot and killed a bald eagle, and the wingspan was always reported. The weight of the bird, if it happened to be weighed, and how it was killed without any sort of condemnation.
Wow. And this was well after it became our national symbol. The seal was what, 1782? Can you talk a little bit
Yes,
about
that's
that?
that's right. So the bald eagle was adopted the Great Seal of the United States, the very first seal, which is a seal we have now, was adopted in 1782, and the bald eagle was put on the front of the Great Seal of the United States. And as a result, many people have, for centuries, confused the bald eagle on the appearing on the Great Seal of the United States as also the national bird. but the Congress never identified it or designated it as a national bird, nor did any president until President Biden did in January 2024. And but you could go to federal websites would claim that the bald eagle is the national bird when it wasn't. It was a national symbol,
Yes.
as you stated correctly, but not the national bird. I mean, even Chat GPT got it wrong, and I corrected Chat a number of times before
No, they get a lot of
2024.
things.
Yeah, well, right, right. But I corrected Chat and I said, "You're wrong," and refer them to my book or it to my book. And I'd go back a month later and ask this question, "What's the national bird?" And they say the bald eagle. I say, "No, it's not." But in any case, the other myth associated with the adoption of the Great Seal of the United States is that Ben Franklin wanted the turkey on the Great Seal of the United States, the wild turkey, and he never said that. There's no evidence that he wanted the wild turkey. Now he did complain about the bald eagle and compare its quote unquote morality with the wild turkey, saying the wild turkey was a quote unquote much more moral bird and honest bird because it went about taking its food honestly, whereas the bald eagle, as he rightly stated, was a thief and a scavenger.
Yeah.
And, it's not necessarily the, traits that you want to associated with your country. And, the other thing you may remember from the book, and I loved writing about this and learning about it and writing about it, is Ben Franklin was on the very first congressional committee appointed to develop or design a Great Seal of the United States. And that committee was appointed just hours after the Declaration of Independence was approved on July 4th, 1776. And his two partners on that committee were Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Stellar, stellar cast, right? Here, here are these guys who gave us American independence, took on King George and no problem. Well, they failed miserably in their design of the Great Seal of the United States. So Congress immediately rejected it. It was so complicated. It was so clustered with images, and what Ben Franklin wanted for the Great Seal of the United States was not the turkey. It was something that you would never imagine. And I'm not going to share it because I want your readers to, I want your listeners to read the book. And you can find it'll blow your mind what Ben Franklin wanted on the Great Seal of the United States, which it blew my mind.
Great founding fathers, not necessarily great graphic designers.
Right, right, right. So that's 1776. Congress, convened two other committees to design a seal, and they failed as well. And so again, it wasn't until 1782 that finally a proper design was approved. And I think it was the right one. As I said, it's the bald eagle's an all-American bird. So I feel as though I'm running on about this. But what's interesting is that eagles as nation states symbols go back to the ancient civilizations and the but no eagle has been the species of no eagle has actually been identifiable on any other nation state symbol until the United States. And it's clearly a bald eagle on that Great Seal of the United
Yeah.
States.
Yeah. And I mean, it's the symbol of the Philadelphia Eagles, American Eagle, American Airlines, United States Postal Service, Eagle Scouts, Eagle in Golf. The Colonel is known as a full bird colonel in the United States
Yeah.
Army. And of course, the U.S. Army 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles.
I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, and it's since the adoption of the Great Seal in 1782. I mean, Americans fell in love with that image, and they started putting the bald eagle on business cards, on business signs, on any sort of motif, Chinaware, you name it. Pajamas, curtains and lampshades. And we've always loved that image, and so it's been around. It's not something that became popular with Harley Davidson.
Yeah.
It's been around a long time.
Well, I guess Americans, or I should say people in general, have always been fascinated with flight and birds and something that we as humans were never able to do. given our own devices. Obviously, we've been able to master flight, but not using just our singular bodies.
Yeah, that's true. And you used the word earlier, majestic, to describe the bald eagle. And that is probably the most common description of the bald eagle. And it dates way back to the early days. I mean, from the colonial period on, people have that's become really the default description for bald eagles is majestic. So I made the decision when I was writing the book, I would not myself describe it that way. I would come up with other descriptions. And, obviously it appears in quotes. But yeah, I mean, there's something about, the power of the bald eagle, the courage, the strength of the bald eagle, that don't tread on me stare of the bald eagle. I mean, it's an ideal symbol for the you know the image we have of our own of our country and our own culture. And it would be wonderful to, if you're going to be live in the wild, why not a bald eagle? It doesn't have, at least the adults have virtually no predators beyond humans. I mean, everybody and everything stays away from the bald eagle. And the young need to be protected, the eggs and the young. But when raccoon hears that chittering cry of the bald eagle, more than likely it's going to stay away from its nest, even if it knows their eggs are in there, because it doesn't want to tangle with a bald eagle on those talons.
I mean, is it the idea of that exceptionalism, the top of the food chain?
Yes, I think that's a really good. The idea of exceptionalism, I think, is fits perfectly, because when we think of our own country and our democracy and the opportunities in this country, we think of American exceptionalism. And I think that it very much fits with bald eagles. I mean, clearly there are other birds that are just as powerful and majestic in the wild, but this is one that, again, we associate closely with ourselves.
Why is the eagle always captured in profile?
That's a good question. I don't know, other than when because for one thing, the eyes are on the side of its head. And like most other birds, not all birds, but I mean, obviously not owls. And but so that's one reason. And I think that profile also shows the hook beak, the raptor beak of the bald eagle, which again, conveys that "don't tread on me" look, and that strength, that beware of me, and or just don't fool with me.
It's one of the things that bald eagle has been called is the Dutch harbor pigeon, and there's definitely a different idea of what the eagle is in the state of Alaska and even in our legislation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in fact, when I was researching the book, I went to Dutch Harbor, Alaska,
Oh,
which is
wow.
out on the Aleutian Islands. And so it's the consistently Dutch Harbor is the most productive commercial fishing port, or village, if you will, in America. And so there's there's a lot of activity there. There's a lot of
Yeah.
fish, and the bald eagles know that. And like brown pelicans, they're smoochers. And they're brown pelicans are always around. Somebody casts a line out into the water, they're always around looking for a handout. And so the bald eagles are on Dutch Harbor looking for opportunity, and they get them. They get them from the crews, those handouts. And so there are a lot of fish there. There's a lot of fish guts that end up in the landfill. And if you're not going to have if you go to Dutch Harbor, you're not going to have any problem seeing eagles. But if for some reason you're not, you go to the dump, and you're sure to see them. So the thing is, it's Alaska has always had an extremely healthy bald eagle population, has, I mean, the salmon, which is a favorite of bald eagles, and just fish generally. I mean, and the place is so rich in marine life that it attracts those species that feed on marine life, and it didn't, whereas we pushed the bald eagle to the brink of extinction during the DDT years in the United States after World War II, largely because of agriculture in its use of DDT, even though everybody, even the people in their homes, use DDT. But Alaska doesn't have, the agricultural economy that the lower 48 states does. So DDT wasn't so widely used up there. And so the bald eagle population didn't feel the impact so much. So it remained healthy. But there was a period there between 1917 and 1952 in which Alaska had a bounty on bald eagles.
Wow.
And because they were regarded as a threat to the salmon industry, that they were stealing from the profits of the salmon fishermen, which is, again, a ridiculous assumption. They predate primarily on spawn on salmon that have already spawned, which are not ideal for human consumption. And those are not the salmon that salmon fishermen would go for. But nevertheless, there was a bounty put on. Turn in a set of talons, you collect 50 cents. And eventually, over those years, it went up to $2 a set of talons. And there were people who made their living as bald eagle bounty hunters.
Wow.
And during those years, I'm forgetting the figure now. I think it was 360,000 sets of talons were turned in to the territorial government of Alaska. But fortunately, that was stopped when Alaska gained statehood. That was one of the conditions of statehood, to end the bounty. And there were many people, political leaders in Alaska, who were opposed to the bounty, and they eventually prevailed. And it's a good thing that they did, because when the lower 48s, needed to restore their bald eagle populations in the 1970s, began doing that in the 1970s after the DDT years, many of those states depended upon relocating eaglets from Alaska to New England, to the Midwest, to Washington and Oregon and California. And so we depended upon their healthy population to repopulate the lower 48.
And so we talked about, you had mentioned DDT. What happened during that era? And there was this Bald Eagle Protection Act in 1940, and then 52, as you mentioned, included Alaska, which I presume again was a condition of their statehood. But we've got this Bald Eagle Protection Act, but yet the DDT wasn't banned until 32 years later. I mean, what happened in those 3 decades?
Yeah, so Bald Eagle Protection Act, I should point out, by the way, included an exemption for Alaska,
Right.
to allow Alaska to go ahead with continue its bounty. And so that went into effect in 1940, making a federal offense punishable by a fine and imprisonment for harming a bald eagle. But then 5 years later, in 1945, DDT was released to the open market, and Americans went crazy for it. It was used everywhere, as I said, in the homes across. We blanketed, not just agricultural properties in the lower 48, but also neighborhoods. There may be listeners, baby boom age listeners such as myself, remember those mosquito trucks driving through the neighborhood. And in the early
Yes.
days, they were spraying DDT. And the chemical industry controlled the narrative on the dangers or lack of dangers on DDT, and they said it's not dangerous.
Of course.
And despite there was evidence dating back to the 40s that indeed it was dangerous for humans and certainly wildlife. So spring fell silent, as Rachel Carson wrote in her wonderful book, published in 1962, with the title of Silent Spring, warning about our excessive use of chemicals pesticides and herbicides, and not calling for a total ban, but just wise use, which we were not engaged in. And so we pushed a lot of bird population, brought a lot of bird species to the brink of extinction. The osprey. I grew up in Florida and on Tampa Bay in the 1970s. And I never saw an osprey until the late 1980s. And I never saw a bald eagle. And not just because of DDT, but also because we had pushed the bay to the brink of ecological collapse as we did bays and bayous and waterways all around America. 70% of our bodies of water around America, including coastal waters, were unsafe for swimming and fishing by 1970. That's eagle habit. That's, an eagle is a fishing raptor, an osprey is a fishing raptor. That's their habitat. It's also our habitat, by the way. And so bald eagle population was in real trouble in the lower 48. New England didn't have None of the New England states outside of Maine had nesting populations. The Midwestern states were all but absent of nesting populations. Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan were the lucky ones who still had some nesting populations. The South, no states outside of Florida in the Southeast had consistent nesting bald eagles. Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee. There were no nesting bald eagles in those states. And we were very close to losing it.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it was that 10 pivotal years between 1962 and 1972
Right.
that really changed the environment and, and ushered in an era of clean air and clean water, and you had the creation of the EPA, you had Rachel Carson's Silent Spring come out in 1962, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, you had the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catching on fire,
Yeah.
which for, listeners, watch the YouTube video, it is the most surreal thing I've literally ever seen in my life. It looks like it's created by AI, but it is literally a river on fire in
Yeah.
downtown Cleveland, Ohio. And it's such a visceral reaction to it, created clean water and clean air and the DDT ban in 72. And then finally the bald eagle was listed as endangered in 1978. Is that really the pivotal year for its recovery?
Yeah. Let me first say that we deserve a pat on the back for changing our ways and recognizing in the late 60s and the 70s that not only had we fouled the nest of birds, we fouled our own nest. And, the Cuyahoga River has, been cleaned up. It's thriving again. Tampa Bay's thriving again. And, and consequently, you know, Cleveland's riverfront has just come alive with businesses and activity. And you can't tell me Tampa Bay area's economy is hurting, and so, and we've made that we've essentially reversed those figures and that I mentioned earlier. 70% of our nation's bodies of water are now safe for swimming and fishing. Congress originally, when it passed the Clean Water Act in 1972, had hoped to have 100% clean waters by the 1980s. They're a bit optimistic, but we worked very hard. Everybody pitched in, businesses, volunteers, policymakers, to get those bays and bayous and rivers healthy again. And that's a wonderful thing. And that, along with restoring that habitat for ourselves and also for fishing raptors like the bald eagle and osprey, brought those helped bring those populations back, along with really with concerted restoration programs launched by U.S. Fish and Wildlife and state wildlife officials and volunteers as well. And to the point that in 2007, the bald eagle was removed from the Endangered Species Act. And I should say that conservation groups were all in favor of the removal of the bald eagle because they knew population was healthy and would
Yeah.
continue to expand afterward, and that proper protections were in place, and we were doing the right thing. But it was the if you will, it was the poster bird for the Endangered Species Act. And conservation groups wanted to say, look, it works. This is why
Yeah.
we need, the Endangered Species Act. It's a success story, and it's
Yeah.
one we should be proud of.
Huge one. I mean, it went from what, a couple hundred nesting pairs to hundreds of
Ju-
thousands?
yeah, in the lower 48 to just under 500 nesting active nesting pairs, and today the estimated North American population, not just nesting but overall, is approximately 500,000, which is the estimated number of birds that existed at the time that Congress adopted or I should say bald eagles, that Congress, at the time that Congress adopted the Great Seal of the United States. Now, how how accurate an estimate taken in 1782 of the bald eagle population is obviously questionable, but I mean, I'm sure there are so many listeners who've noticed just in the past 10, 15 years how bald eagles have come back into our life. And this is especially true of baby boomers who didn't see bald eagles unless you lived in Alaska or or in Minnesota.
Right.
And, we see them all the time.
Right.
And we could not imagine harming a bald eagle today. I
Yeah.
mean, that's how our values have changed, and along with the effective policy.
Yeah, if you were to do a search of articles about bald eagles shot from the '70s to today, it would probably include the prison sentence of the perpetrator.
And just read the comments,
Yes,
to the
right,
article.
right, yes. Pitchforks coming out, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, 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 which is an amazing story, and you talked about there's something called hacking and how they reintroduced the bald eagle. How was that done?
Yeah. So hacking was a technique that was borrowed from falconry dating centuries earlier, and so I'd mentioned that bald eagles were taken from Alaska, or eaglets were taken from Alaska to repopulate places like the Midwest and New England. And so what wildlife officials would do is they would take, if a nest had, typically bald eagles lay two eggs,
Mhm.
and sometimes three, sometimes one. And so wildlife officials would take an eaglet out of a active nest only if there was more than one eaglet in the nest,
Okay.
and they would take the runt because sometimes the runt gets beat up by its sibling and even killed, and there's less chance of survival. So they would take the runt, and they would relocate it at 5, 6 weeks of age to a hack box in, say, in New England, Quabbin Reservoir. If anybody from Massachusetts is listening, or in New England generally, they'll be familiar with Quabbin Reservoir. And they would relocate the eaglets to Quabbin Reservoir and put them in these hack boxes, which are essentially giant, large lion cages, built on stilts, as if it's in with fabricated nests within the hack boxes, and they're open to the elements, just like a real nest is, and they're up high, so they get a view of their territory, just like a real nest. And so they would be fed from behind blinds while they're living in the hack boxes, and until around 16 weeks of age, which is around the time they fledge. And but what happens is that they would imprint on their environment. And in their minds, and the eagle's mind, that would become their natal territory. Quabbin Reservoir would become their natal territory, even though they may have been hatched in, Minnesota or Canada or Alaska. But Quabbin now is their natal territory, and bald eagles will return to their natal territory when they reach breeding age to build their own nest, to find their partner, and to lay eggs. And Fish and Wildlife did this across the country, and it's a huge success. It was first experimented with in upstate New York in 1976 on the bicentennial, and it proved to be at Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. So if any of your listeners drives down the New York Thruway, They have seen that giant bald eagle sculpture or statue on the
I've
south
seen it.
side of the thruway in the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. That is to honor, to recognize that successful restoration hacking program that was, again, copied all across the United States, and to bring the eagle population back to, you know, a a thriving level. Hugely successful.
Well, in the third act of this conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit about the ecology and life cycle of an eagle, and you started talking a little bit there. Fledging. How long do they live? What does a year look like for them? What are their migration patterns?
So they live to be in the wild. They can live well into their 20s, in some cases, even 30s. And in captivity, there have been a few who have lived to be 40. And so they, as I said, they're fishing raptors. They will take food from the air and from the land, but they prefer fish. They take the majority of their food from the water. They build their nest typically within, 100 yards or a couple of 100 yards of a healthy body of water. And they like tall trees with an open view. It's all about location, location, location for them when they build their nest. And so they, as I said, they like to fish from the perch because it conserves energy. And so if you're out on a lake, kayaking or boating, and you see a bald eagle in a perch, on a branch, just looking out over the lake, it's looking for fish. And if you happen to be fishing, it's watching you. Let me tell you, it is
That's me.
watching you. I write about somebody who was duck hunting and lost his first kill to to a bald eagle. That's a great story. I loved writing about that. But and so they mate for life, and they build a nest that they maintain a fidelity to as long as that tree exists, as long as that nest exists. They will return to that nest after breeding season. They will, and they're like us. They like to add on to their homes. They refurbish their nest every year when they return, and it ultimately gets bigger and bigger. They can reach 5, 6 feet across. There's
Wow.
one nest I write about that was 8 feet across and 12 feet deep and weighed 2 tons. And
Wow.
this was this was up in Vermilion, Ohio, near Lake Erie. And it was estimated to be a 35-year-old nest when the old hickory that it was in finally said enough is enough. 2 tons is forget you, and then
Yeah.
collapsed. So so breeding season varies from a region. In the South, they tend to breeding season tends to start a little bit earlier than in the North. And for instance, here in Florida, we're in breeding season now, and I just saw a report that the first noted eggs have been laid, and they will stay here until so they fledge, as I said, the eagles fledge around 16 weeks, but they stick around till about 20 weeks till the end of breeding season, which in Florida here is, early summer. And at the end of breeding season, everybody leaves the nest. Everybody tends to leave the area. The eaglets will go their way, mom will go her way, dad will go his way, which, as I like to say, may be the secret to their lifetime commitment to each other. And the southern bald eagles tend to fly north, and the northern bald eagles tend to fly south after breeding season. And so they'll actually, as I say, there's Saskatchewan bald eagles, that the nesting bald eagles who spend the off season in Colorado. They're Colorado bald eagles who spend the off season in Saskatchewan. So apparently they're
Wow.
crossing each other in the air as They're migrating, but there's no really set pattern other than that. And in some cases, some bald eagles don't migrate, just like cranes. Some cranes don't migrate from the south; they'll stay here year round, and herons and others. As long as there's food, I mean, that's the key. They go where they think there's food and or know there will be food. So Florida bald eagles will migrate as far as Canada. But in some cases, they won't go any farther than Georgia. And it's the same with northern bald eagles. Some northern bald eagles, they don't go very far. They can handle the cold. They're heavier than the southern bald eagles, and they can handle the cold. It's just a matter of whether or not they can get the food. They can see that white rabbit in the light snow. They can break through thin ice to get the fish, and they'll do that. But in some cases, they will. In Minnesota, up in the Wabasha, Minnesota area, the eastern Minnesota on the Mississippi River, the river doesn't completely ice over, and there's fish all year round, and some of those bald eagles will stay year round.
And the bald eagle children, once they leave the nest, are they on their own after that 20-week period?
They are,
Mm.
and so as I said earlier, they're not expert fishers yet, and so they steal, they scavenge, they're at risk because they're not as good at getting food as mom and dad were. Now, when they leave their natal territory, mom and dad have fed them, and mom and dad continue to bring food back to the nest after the young have fledged, and then they stay there from 16 to 20 weeks or whatever. And so mom and dad, it's like our kids, you
Yeah.
know, and they're going to hang around if there's food in
Yeah.
the refrigerator, right? And so, but they'll go off on their own. They're on their own, and they have to depend upon themselves. And often the juveniles will return to their natal territory after the end of when breeding season starts again, because they remember how well mom and dad fed them, and they'll come back. But mom and dad won't tolerate them. Say, nope, new generation, you're not. We're not helping you out. You're on your own. And so, but like right here, in places like Conowingo Dam, you see in the wintertime, in between the breeding season, you see mature bald eagles and immature bald eagles together fishing. And the lower side of Conowingo Dam, because the fish come through the dam tunnels stunned or dead, and so it's free
Uh,
pickings.
yeah.
And but and they'll fight in midair over fish. When I was writing the book, a photographer and I were out shooting pictures of bald eagles fishing in the morning, and we saw two bald eagles fighting over a fish in midair, in which that fish went between the two of them 5 times. Uh,
Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
it was
So,
really, they just so it forces the bird to drop it, and the other one catches it in midair. And the other one comes back saying, "No, that's my fish," and it repeats what just happened to them. And again, that's how they get fish from ospreys, which have a higher success rate of catch rate than bald eagles do, and approximately 70% compared with 30%, and maybe 35%. And so they harass that osprey until it drops that fish, and then they catch it in midair. So, but
I
osprey have been known to steal from bald eagles too, so they get
good
they get
for them.
revenge now and then.
I mean, I came across a word in your book that I didn't know existed, kleptoparasitism.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which again, it's uh, it applies to wild species that steal their food from others, and
Yeah.
it's quite common in nature.
Well, anything about the book that stood out to you that was surprising, that you didn't realize before beginning the project?
Well, one thing is John James Audubon, and my image of him. really changed in doing the research and writing for the book. It's ironic that his name is associated with the uh, best known, conservation organization in the United States
Yeah.
because he was anything but that. And he could be pretty cruel when it came to wildlife, which is, not uncommon in those days. And from the perspective of people in those days outside of native cultures, our treatment of wildlife was not necessarily considered cruel. But John James Audubon, he didn't shoot birds just simply for art. I mean, he went out and he would shoot, a couple of hundred waterfowl just for the quote unquote sport of it. And I doubt if he was able to consume those few hundred, and especially in the days before refrigeration.
Really?
But he also hated the bald eagle with a passion, and it was he truly his favorite bird was in fact the wild turkey, and he wanted the wild turkey as the symbol of his country, not the bald eagle. In fact, he had an image of the wild turkey on his calling card, and he wrote he didn't hold punches when it came to his complaints about the bald eagle in his ornithological biographies that accompanied the Wild Birds of America. And the he called it a thief, a dishonest bird, a brute, you name it. And so that surprised me. But again, also his own indifference to the life of the lives of wild species. I found troubling. Whereas other ornithologists were like that too, but then there were other many who didn't take that sort of position and were more ahead of their time, and which if we're gonna revere somebody like John James Audubon, I would like to think that he was ahead of his time, but he wasn't.
Yeah, it was strange times, but I mean, his club, at least his namesake organization, was instrumental in helping protect the bird.
You know, not initially. National Audubon would not. So the first proposal to adopt bald eagle protection or legislation to protect the bald eagle was in 1930, and the chief ornithologist for National Audubon testified before Congress and essentially undermine the any chance for a positive vote to adopt the legislation in 1930. And the head of Audubon, T. Gilbert Pearson, who grew up not far from me here in Gainesville, Florida, in bald eagle country, he was opposed to protection as well. He supported the Alaska bounty. And so it was a while before National Audubon finally came on board. By 1945, National Audubon did support legislation to protect the bald eagle.
But
Oh, by
decades.
1940, excuse me, by 1940, I said 45. So,
You're talking about North Florida. Can you tell us a little bit about the statue that was recently erected?
yeah, I mean, that was another pleasant surprise for me when I was writing the book. I discovered when I was writing about restoration, I discovered a restoration program that was launched right here in North Central Florida, where I live. That was launched by University of Florida along with the Sutton Wildlife Center in Oklahoma, and an innovative program that was launched in the 1980s to help restore the southern states. And so the actually it was actually Sutton Center that came up with the idea that to take eggs from bald eagle nest in Florida, because it still had a fairly healthy population, but not healthy enough to remove eaglets like they were doing elsewhere. So Steve Sherrard, who was head of the Sutton Center, said, eggs out of the nests, bald eagles in Florida, right after they're laid. And that way, the female will lay a second clutch, and the bald eagles in Florida won't lose population. And let's take those eggs and bring them up to the Sutton Center in Oklahoma and hatch them beneath cochin hens. And those are the hens that have the booted feet. The feathers go all the way down practically to their toes or to their toes, but we and technically and then raise them to about 8 weeks and then remove those and then move the eaglets to Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Arkansas, and the other southern states and put them in hack towers and let them imprint on that environment. And so from 1984 to 1992, they removed 275 eggs from the Florida bald eagles. University of Florida's or the people who were scientists are removing them, identifying the nests and removing the eggs. Sutton Center is doing the rest. And during that period, the hatch rate for those 275 eggs was 100%. Yeah, hugely successful. And so as I was writing about this, I thought, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. We need to honor these bald eagles in north central Florida, right here where I live. I didn't know this
Yeah.
had been going on. And so I came up with this idea, which was inspired by the Montezuma statue on the New York Thruway, because when I first saw it, I said, "What the heck is that?" And then I did some research, found out what was going on. I said, "We need to do something of the same down here. Let's honor these bald eagles whose eggs were responsible for repopulating the other southern states." And so I was able to raise money from Duke Energy, Florida, to fund this statue. And I found a wonderful sculptor, metal sculptor, who was all for the idea. And I said, let's portray not your typical bald eagle with its wings spread out, which is a great image, but let's do a domestic scene. And said, I want a nest. I want 2 eggs in it. I want one parent on the side of the nest and the other parent flying into the nest. And he loved the idea, and he built the statue that turned out to be 9 feet tall, 850 pounds, completely out of repurposed stainless steel. Because I said, we need to make it low maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
And he did just a beautiful job. And so just a couple of weeks ago, I was able to meet with a conservation group here, land conservation group here, Lateral Conservation Trust. They have this beautiful piece of property conservation property overlooking Orange Lake, which is where a lot of the bald eagle eggs were taken back in the 80s. And they agreed, locate the statue here. So it's just an ideal place. So now you go see the statue, you look out over Orange Lake, and you also see bald eagles, live bald eagles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So beautiful monument to a noble bird and amazing document, The Bald Eagle, The Improbable Journey of America's Bird. Jack, you've written a lot of books. You're the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. What are you working on next?
I'm working on a book about the larger American coast, both East Coast and the West Coast, and the Gulf Coast too, of course. And what I'm doing is using history to help us try to better understand how we ended up with our unprecedented environmental challenges on the coast today, and finding the history really, really interesting. A lot of fascinating stories, and really enjoying writing about it, both the East Coast and the West Coast.
All right. Well, when that comes out, we'll have to have you back.
And be happy to come on board. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Well, Jack, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.